Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the BC Brain Wellness Program, March Wellness Wednesday. My name is Elsa and I'm a program assistant with the Brain Wellness Program. I would like to acknowledge that the BC Brain Wellness Program at the Jabed Mulafagian Center for Brain Health is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples here at the UBC Vancouver campus. I am grateful to be joining you from this land today. However, since we are all in this virtual space, I would like to invite you to take a moment to reflect from where you're joining from today. So this month we have three excellent speakers who will be talking about mental health. To start, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Fidel Vila-Rodriguez. Dr. Vila-Rodriguez is a clinical scientist with a strong interest in conducting translational research that bridges our understanding of neurobiology of psychiatric disorders with clinical applications of this knowledge. His clinical practice is actively focused on those most severely afflicted by such conditions, and his research interests are directed at finding novel therapeutic interventions with non-invasive neurostimulation therapies. So with that, I'm going to invite Dr. Vila-Rodriguez to take the floor and start his presentation.
Thanks so much, Elsa, and thank you for the invitation to present today. It's always a great pleasure to engage with the wellness program as well as with everyone, members of the public. And in the format that we have today, we only have 10 to 15 minutes. So I was saying earlier that I feel a bit ambitious, and I'm going to try to tackle a few complex questions. And a little bit of context. I'm a psychiatrist, but I also work with the Parkinson's group at the Center for Brain Health. And so a lot of these questions or the things that I'm going to talk about are things that come up when I see people in consultation, and they're very difficult to formally and in detail formulate. But I believe that we all have a good intuitions about them. So today I'm going to try to do that, to make an attempt to those intuitions, translate them into a model that can help guide what we are talking about when we discuss aspects of mental health in the context of neuropsychiatric conditions. So these are the three ideas and concepts that I would like to tackle today. So many times we struggle with what is mental health compared to what is a mental illness. Similarly, and when it comes to symptoms and to aspects that involve emotions, we struggle to disentangle what are feelings and emotions that are, and I hate to use this word, normal, versus what are symptoms of a mental illness. Similarly, life happens, and we all face situations that put us at test, that put our capacity to cope and to deal with situations at test. And currently, we are dealing with one such a situation all collectively with the pandemic. So in the context of a stressor, of a life stressor, we do feel an impact no matter what. And so we develop mechanisms and we adjust to it. And that's not necessarily a clinical diagnosis. That's not necessarily a mental illness, but sometimes the boundary, the transition from one to another is a bit blurry. And so I'll try to discuss further how we can go about trying to distinguish what is more of an adjustment reaction compared to what is established clinical diagnosis of a mental illness. So I appreciate we're talking about mental health and mental illness, but I couldn't resist to start with a non-brain example. And I couldn't resist starting with the heart as a biological system and as an organ that it's involved and that can get ill. And so we can have heart diseases, but the performance of our hearts are also involved in with the idea and the concept of how physically fit or shape. And I think we all intuitively understand that there's this dimension of whether our heart has a disease, you know, a cardiovascular event, a ischemic event, a heart attack, or whether it does not have that, and that it's separate from the dimension as to whether we are very fit physically or we are just out of shape. In the context of the pandemic, I've been sitting around quite a bit, so I'm just quite out of shape. But thankfully, fortunately, in this dimension, even though I'm out of shape, thankfully I'm not suffering a heart disease. So it's possible to be out of shape and not have a heart disease. Sorry, to the left. The same way, when people suffer a heart attack, one of the treatments that they do after the acute episode is engage in rehabilitation and increase their level of fitness. It is a treatment, but even though they have suffered a heart attack, they can be in good shape and can move along this continuum. Now, let's try to take this analogy and look at what happens with mental health and the brain. I believe we can also conceptualize in a similar way. We have the same axis here, the continuum, where we are talking about a mental illness or not struggling with a mental illness. But similarly, the same way that we can speak about or of physical fitness, I think we can talk about mental health. And the equivalent of physical fitness in terms of mental health are aspects like having engaging in an excellent network of supports, having that social network, meeting with friends. Not coincidentally, it's not a coincidence as well that actually physical activity, it's actually part of this good mental health, is a very, very strong aspect related to good mental health. On the other hand, when we get kind of isolated, overworked, we don't have time to work out, we experience a life stressor, or mental health can just maybe go down. But that does not necessarily mean that we are struggling with mental illness. And the same way, when we are suffering a mental illness, or we are having symptoms of depression, of anxiety, in the context of a neuropsychiatric condition, we can work on aspects to improve our mental health. And later on in subsequent talks, we are going to hear about some of those strategies. So I hope this helps providing a little bit of context of what we mean when we talk about mental health versus what we mean when we talk about mental illness. If we take this one step beyond, for didactic purposes, I was portraying these dimensions as a continuum, and they were kind of rigid and very separate. But I think we all have an intuition that there's kind of this funky relationship between these two, where the more we invest and we are able to put on good mental health, the more likely that we are to just move to not being at risk or not developing a mental illness. And the other way around, the more that we move along this axis down to poor mental health, the higher the chances that there is that a mental illness emerges. And I want to point out to one aspect that in mathematics is called the nonlinearity. This is a curve, and this is called a sigmoid curve. It has these two curves that are very different. And what it means is that it's not proportional. So there is probably a point where the more poor mental health that we add, the more that it accelerates towards mental illness. And the same happens when we are kind of working on treatments and working on improving our good mental health. Maybe there's a phase where we are putting a lot of effort and maybe we're just not noticing a lot of progress in moving in this direction. But then all of a sudden, whoop, it happens. And we dramatically move towards the no mental health spectrum. This is another very complex idea and concept, and it's somewhat related to what we've been talking all along about these two axes in terms of good mental health or mental illness. Symptoms and feelings are two different but related concepts. We all feel, we all have feelings and emotions. They happen. They're not a disease. We can feel sad, we can feel happy, we can feel worried, nervous. That's our part of our makeup, and it's a very important dimension of us as human beings. And even for feelings or experiences that might be unpleasant or uncomfortable, I'm always very reluctant them to call them bad or negative. They are unpleasant. They don't make feel as good, but good things can come out of feeling appropriately sad when sad things happen in our life, or to worry about things when we're dealing with uncertainty in our life and we just need to think hard about what to do. And who's not experienced a little bit of nervousness before a test or a talk on Zoom? It's normal. It helps. I was just preparing the slides and was trying to be very as conscientious as possible to prepare this talk. So my nervousness did help me to invest time and just to try to do the best I could. It wasn't bad. Now, it would have been bad if I was not able to sleep last night because I was so anxious about the talk today that it interfered with my sleep. Thankfully, I was able to sleep well, and I'm feeling fresh this morning, and I wasn't feeling anxious last night or the days before. In this end of the spectrum, we have symptoms. And it's really hard many times to come up with words and terms that define symptoms. Sometimes in every day, I use it sometimes. I'm feeling anxious. What do I mean? That I'm feeling nervous, or that I'm just struggling with the symptom? It's very hard. There are symptoms that are more clear-cut. For example, delusions are qualified plainly as symptoms. There's not a normal delusion, so to speak. Can be argued. But we have to resort, in terms of language, to artifacts like calling it depressed mood as in trying to differentiate just from feeling depressed, low, or down, or sad as a normal feeling. But in language, and when we engage uh, in assessments, we do try to make that distinction all the time. We try to gauge when something that is presented, an experience, is more in keeping with a feeling, a reaction that is in keeping with the context that the person is experiencing, or it goes beyond. And that leads me to the last slide, and is very, which is actually this one, and it's talking about, as the title says, differentiating what is a clinical condition versus what is an adjustment reaction. It's extremely difficult when we are in the transition part. There's no question when we are at the extremes, right? And all of us can relate to the aspect when we've received any transcendental news or experience any really important change in your lives, and receiving a diagnosis of Parkinson's or Alzheimer's does qualify for a transcendental change in one's life. It just changes the perspective completely of what's ahead of us. So that can generate nervousness, can make us worried, can make us sad, or even sometimes a little bit anxious. Everyone, when receives a diagnosis, or it's in the process of learning what about their condition, they can experience a range of emotions, and that can be most of the times a reaction, and that needs some adjustment. Sometimes it goes beyond that, and then we make a diagnosis of a clinical condition. And now I am moving to the last slide uh, to provide this kind of summary of all these graphs into, first of all, making a statement that developing mental illness in the context of neuropsychiatric conditions uh, is frequent. Uh, the rates for depression, roughly in Parkinson's, are around 30% of people would experience. But before we get there, receiving the news, learning about or experiencing the progression of difficulties and challenges, it affects us. And not only the person who receives the diagnosis, but their friends and their family. The system suffers that impact. A wide range of feelings can emerge, and they many times are very intense. And adjusting to the new normal. Sorry, that was my timer for 15 minutes. So I reached my limit, but I'm just going to finish this sentence before I wrap up. And I was saying that facing the uncertainty is a very difficult aspect of dealing with a new diagnosis, and it can challenge our mental health. And sometimes that, along with the neuropsychiatric condition, can affect the brain in a way that leads to the development of a mental illness. In this case, could be depression or an anxiety disorder in the context of these neuropsychiatric conditions. And this last point is just to make the point that the brain is very complex and is very interconnected. So it's not surprising that if a condition like Parkinson's that affects primarily the dopamine system, it's not unreasonable to think that it's not only movement and the motor system that gets affected, but eventually what happens there can have an impact on other systems and parts of the brain, and lead to the emergence of symptoms and sometimes a clinical diagnosis. I apologize to other speakers. I run a little bit of over time. This brings my talk to the end. Thank you so much for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Vila-Rodriguez, for that talk. That was really interesting, and I really appreciate how you explained kind of the symptoms and all of that. So thank you so much again, and thank you for joining us. We'll
No
move
problem.
on to our next speaker now. So our next speaker today is Dr. Krista Glowacki, who is an occupational therapist who has worked in the field of mental health for over a decade. She recently completed her doctorate exploring the relationship of mental health and physical activity at the University of British Columbia. She co-developed the Exercise and Depression Toolkit, and most recently started working as a postdoctorate research fellow with Dr. Skye Barbic and the community organization Foundry. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Glowacki to take the floor.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and just before I get into it, and thanks, Fidel, that was a great talk. There's a link that's in the chat, and so it's a bit of an activity that I want to pull in. So if you're comfortable, you can pull it up on your mobile or whatever device you're on, and I'll kind of share that a bit when I get into it. So I'm just going to share my screen. Elsa, can you just give me a thumbs up if you can see? Yeah, okay, awesome. Oh, sorry. I don't know how to present it. I can't access that. Sorry, everyone. Here. Okay. There we go. So Elsa has done this, but again, I think it's important to acknowledge with gratitude that I'm living on the traditional and taken land of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So today I want to start with an activity and hopefully get to know you and everyone who's here a bit better. I'll then talk about a resource, Exercise and Depression Toolkit. I'll end with some strategies as well as some resources that hopefully you can take home with you after this. So called it a jam sesh. We're not going to get instruments and play and make a band. That would be great. But yeah, if you can pull up that link. Okay, there we go. Awesome. So I just want to take a moment to try and answer this question. So what do you like and dislike about physical activity? And this is anonymous. So if you can see my mouse, you just click on this sticky note here. And so I'm going to start. I like the feeling after I am done. I'm thinking specifically when I go for a run. I don't really enjoy running, but I like the feeling after. So if people feel comfortable, you can just go on your own screen, click on the sticky note, and I'd love to just get some input from everyone here. So it's this, if you see my mouse here, if you take your mouse, yeah, awesome. I think I see someone doing that. Okay, so some are coming up. Amazing. I like getting outside and getting fresh air. I enjoy nature and walking and running, feeling energized, feeling of accomplishment. Yeah, I love all that. Okay, these are all positives. Any dislikes? Oh, here. I like knowing I'm working towards maintaining my health, knowing I've done something good for myself. I don't like exercising alone. Yeah, that was really common thing we heard with our work, talking to people with depression, is they wanted to do it with somebody. Enjoy biking, hiking, walking outdoors. I like being done. Yeah, me too. Love hanging out with my dog and exercise. Getting started. Oh, this is amazing. Thank you guys. I don't have time to go through all of that. But I can access this after. So it's hard. Thanks for everyone who participated there. For sake of time, I'll keep going, but I appreciate getting to know you guys. So I'll talk a bit about this resource, the Exercise and Depression Toolkit. So what in the heck is it? Some of you may have heard of it, some may have not. So it's an evidence-based resource. It's meant for healthcare providers and individuals with depression to collaboratively consider exercise as a treatment option. And we launched it in 2019, and it's free to download on our website. The link will be included again later. So I want to backtrack a little bit and kind of why we created it and how. And so I think Fidel kind of touched on a really important point. So when I'm talking about depression and these treatment guidelines, I am referring to clinical depression. And so that comes into play with these symptoms that he spoke of and the severity of symptoms. And usually clinically, you'd have a diagnosis from a physician or a psychiatrist. And also those symptoms usually persist for a period of time. And I think that may be getting into when you start to have, feelings versus symptoms. Okay, so backtrack again. In 2016, these treatment guidelines were released. And so they acknowledge, first line treatments for depression, medication, psychotherapy, which are very commonly known. And then they also just acknowledge more recently that exercise and the vast amount of evidence to support that can be used to treat mild to moderate depression on its own, or in combination with medication and psychotherapy for moderate to severe depression. And again, that distinction is based on the severity of symptoms. So exercise not only reduces symptoms, it has so many positive benefits. It can help with quality of life, feelings of accomplishment, socialization if you're doing it with others, reduce your risk of heart disease, lung disease. So lots of benefits other than just treating depression. So these guidelines are great. These are this knowledge, the kind of what, right? We can use exercise for depression now, but they don't really tell us much about how to do that. So how can we actually implement these guidelines into practice? And that's what stemmed the work around creating the Exercise and Depression Toolkit. So I'll just briefly talk about how we developed it, because we really prioritize a co-design approach. So we worked with people with depression, healthcare providers, kind of all the way through, and prioritize, working with these stakeholders who would actually be using this toolkit one day. So we conducted 2 literature reviews. So we looked at people with depression and engaging in exercise and what barriers they experience. So I think that was brought up on the Jamboard just about doing it with others. That was something that they either felt was a barrier if they didn't have someone to do it with, or they felt that that could help them engage in exercise, just as an example. Our other literature review looked at healthcare providers and actually promoting physical activity in their practice and what they experience. We then conducted interviews, so with people with depression and healthcare providers in Canada to get their experiences and opinions. We then held an expert panel meeting, so we brought together a group of people with lived experience with depression, healthcare providers, researchers, exercise professionals, and we all came together and we looked at the evidence from the previous phases and then made recommendations, which ultimately led to this toolkit development, which I'll show you the kind of final product afterwards. So we partnered with a graphic designer and we created this resource, and then, as I mentioned, hosted it on a website and kind of launched it and went live in 2019. Okay, so I want to take a moment to get into some practical strategies. So this is actually a screenshot of the toolkit. So what I want to highlight here is, based on the literature reviews we did, we found these really important barriers that people experience to engaging in exercise, or common concerns. And so a few are highlighted here. And I think just going off the example that I've kind of continued to use is, one is I don't have anyone to exercise with. But what I also want to highlight here is what came out of it is that it's really important to individualize the approach to yourself. So different people experience different barriers. So there's some examples here, but you might also have other barriers. So for me personally, the weather is a barrier. In Vancouver, I grew up in Ontario, it's sunny, cold, but the rain and gray really gets to me in the winter. So that's one of my barriers to going outdoors. So I would just highlight here to consider your personal barriers and what you experience. and then make an action plan of how you might want to address them if you're considering engaging in more activity. So a lot of text is here. I don't know what I'm at for time. I was hoping to make this a bit more interactive as well. Have people used the reaction button at the bottom of Zoom before? I'm not sure. I might just try a couple. So what I'm going to do is read some of these out. And so these are practical strategies or actions you can take to address some of those barriers or concerns that you might experience. And so the ones you see here labeled 1 to 5 are actually resources in the toolkit that you can go and access if you were interested in trying them. So I'm going to read a couple out, and then what I would encourage is, if you can, there's a reaction button at the bottom of Zoom and you can click on it. And I would just love to see your initial reaction of how you feel about trying a strategy like that out. So the first one is use a mood and activity diary to record how you feel. So your mood and energy levels before, during, or after exercise. So I'm just going to scroll through to see if there's any reactions. Okay, I see a thumbs up, a clapping sign, thumbs up. Okay, cool. Set SMART goals. So, and celebrate all your accomplishments in your journey. Okay, I got a celebration reaction. I think that's good. Another celebration one. Cool. Try different types of exercise to find what you personally enjoy. So I think that's a big one for me. I love to try a variety of different things, and it keeps me kind of engaged. Okay, I see some other thumbs up, so other people like that one too. Okay, so try one more, or maybe two more. So try exercise that does not cost money other than gear, if you're considering, such as hiking, walking, running, cycling, or gardening. So I think this came up in the Jamboard that this was a popular reason or what people liked about physical activity. Okay, so you can access the rest of these through the toolkit if you're looking for some more strategies. Thank you for participating. I appreciate it. It's nice to know that you can kind of engage when there's an audience virtually. So this point, I always bring this up in my mental health work with recovery and people going through that journey, because often, it just shows that recovery is a journey, and there's going to be lots of bumps and barriers and things that happen along the way. And I think the same can apply for engaging in physical activity if you're wanting to, engage in more physical activity or increase your levels. So I think that applies here. And for me, I always just like to say, any movement's better than none. So if your movement for today is, doing one flight of stairs or walking from the bed to the kitchen, that's great. That's better than nothing. So, meet yourself where you're at and go on your journey that way. I won't go through these resources, but I did highlight some on campus as well as off campus. And then I also just wanted to highlight that in light of the pandemic, a lot of studios or gyms have adapted to virtual online classes, which, thinking of my personal barrier of the weather, that actually makes it a lot more accessible. So I had a client I was working with who really wanted to try Zumba. So we found the Zumba Vancouver website together, and they had live pre-recorded sessions, or you could log into a virtual class live, kind of as you're doing now in this presentation. So I just wanted to highlight some of those. Also, some educational resources here, and there's the link to the toolkit. So it's exerciseanddepression.ca. It is free to download if you're interested. I just want to thank all our partners and acknowledge who worked with us to create the resource. So CAMAT, CMHA, Center for Active Living, and then CIHR who funded it. And thank you to the BC Brain Wellness Program for hosting me today and putting on this series, and a lot of references if anyone's interested, and then questions I think we'll save to the end.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Glowacki. That was really nice. And thank you for highlighting those resources. I will remind people also that we have a lot of exercise classes and other resources available here at the Brain Wellness Program, and they are all virtual right now and free. So our registration for spring is going to open on March 19th, and those programs will start on March 29th. So that's really great, and I really kind of enjoyed those virtual activities. So thank you so much again, Dr. Glowacki, for joining us today. If you do have any questions, feel free to send them into the chat box now. And Dr. Glowacki and Dr. Vila-Rodriguez are still here and will be able to answer those. We have one question here. Is the exercise toolkit available to the public?
Yep, definitely. And it's free. There's just a brief survey you have to fill out. So it's exerciseanddepression.ca, and then you'll see a toolkit tab. And so the survey, you can do it anonymously. You don't have to give your information if you don't want to. But if you do, you can put your email address, and that's the only kind of thing you have to do to access the toolkit. And then it's a PDF that you download.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Glowacki. Another question, is there any kind of program available that is associated with the toolkit?
Great question, Andrea. We're hoping that's going to become available. Not yet. We piloted it on campus for students seeking mental health services, and there was a program available, but in the greater public, no. So that's kind of on the onus of the healthcare provider using it to help somebody find an appropriate program or resources. But that's kind of next steps that we're hoping that would be, you use the toolkit and then you get referred to a program, but not yet. So if you know any, you can let me know, but we're hoping that'll come.
Awesome, thank you. Another question here, maybe both speakers can touch on this one. Sometimes friends and family are reluctant to take the leap to try a new strategy. Do you have anything to suggest to help people take the leap?
Go ahead, Fidel. No, you go. I already talked a lot.
I'll take the leap and say that just be brave. Try it out. The worst that can happen, and then I'll use the example of physical activity because not only it's an extremely important one, but it's also one that can be associated with all gains. If you try something out and that doesn't work out, that's the worst that can happen. You just try it in a different way. And along the theme that was emerging today, it's like don't put a lot of or extreme expectations. Small gains, incremental gains, and just getting and attempting and trying to move in the positive direction. It's all we want. So if you apply that strategy to other aspects, meeting with friends, expanding your social network, try it out, take the leap.
Thank you. Dr. Glowacki, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think so reminding people of every step counts. And, I a lot with my clients, if they make a goal to do, let's say, an exercise class, but they don't actually do it, them making that goal in the first place is a great step. So, acknowledging all the accomplishments along the way, self-compassion, and as Fidel said, taking the leap. And what's the worst that could happen? Like in that scenario, I've seen it where people didn't reach their goal and then they felt really down on themselves. But, we just reframe it. Well, that goal was an amazing step. So next time, maybe you'll actually go to the class, but you're already thinking about it. So.
Definitely. Thank you for that answer. Another question, maybe for Dr. Vila-Rodriguez, is depression always associated with anxiety?
Not always. And there are many situations where fundamentally the person has predominantly depression or only anxiety. However, them presenting at the same time is very common. Not always, but it's fairly common. And many times is tricky to tease out whether anxiety came first and it was there for a bit of time, and then depression came up, or what is the relationship between the two? So not always, but often.
Okay, great. And maybe just one more here. Are depression and anxiety the main triggers for addiction? If you're able to answer that one.
So that question, it's similar to this idea that I was just alluding to, is if you have anxiety, does that lead to depression? We don't know the precise answer, but with regards specifically to addiction, I think it's important to think about addiction as a mental illness of itself. There can be other symptoms, anxiety, depression in the context of addictions, but addictions is an illness and needs treatment to address it on of its own. So for that one, I would think more of an entity on its own that needs to be addressed. And I would think that if there are anxiety symptoms or mood symptoms, they are part of this illness, that it's the addiction. I hope that was where the question was kind of leading to.
Yeah, I think that was really helpful. Thank you so much. So on that note, that was going to be our last question for today. Thank you so much to our speakers for joining us today and supporting the BC Brain Wellness Program. We've really appreciated your time and support. And then also thank you to everyone who's joined in today. It's been so great to see so many people on the call. I hope that you were able to learn something new and take something away from these presentations. So take care. Our spring session, as I mentioned, registration is starting on March 15th and programs are starting on March 29th. Those are all free of charge and available on our website at bcbrainwellness.ca. Thank you so much again and have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.